that, the ability to disperse that force using a non-lethal system would be very advantageous and eliminates the situation of you having to fire upon civilians in an environment where that's the last thing that you really want to do.
Obviously, if your goal is to cause your opponent to desist in whatever he's doing that you don't like, as opposed to killing him, then these are ideal weapons. And as we become more civilized, and as the face of war gets more widely broadcast, the days where I think it would be politically acceptable to create mass carnage on the battlefield like was in World War I, those days are past politically. So, in point of fact, as a reality, we must have weapons that make war, if you will, to the extent it can be, make war in a more civilized manner.
Electromagnetic weapons could be more civilized than conventional weapons, but the long-term effects of the atomic bomb were at first downplayed and poorly understood.
Yes, atomic warfare staggers the imagination. But atomic warfare is still the old story. Get there fastest with the mostest. And because automatic bombing, although in the predictable future, is still not yet here, the best way to get the mostest there the fastest is by the wings of the Air Force.
Every weapon has its unintended and its unexpected consequences. You only have to look at the nuclear weapon to see that. We see the Gulf War syndrome, now believed perhaps to be traceable back to exposure to chemicals during that war, maybe to the Debused again in the new war. They're not really sure about it. Nevertheless, it's acknowledged that they have had health effects that the veterans of other wars did not have, and they're being compensated by the government.
The government may know more than the rest of us about the potential health effects of these sorts of systems. We do know that the Air Force has a human systems laboratory where they have been researching what these devices could potentially do to humans. That research has not yet been made public. Theoretically, these weapons are meant to affect electronics without hurting humans, but obviously it will take years and years until we truly know all the health ramifications of how these weapons operate.
These weapons work with directed energy, much like harnessing the power of an overcharged lightning bolt. When the blast occurred at the Beckford home, it was difficult to assess if the mysterious phenomenon had human consequences. Neighbors said Susie Beckford was never the same again. It may be a coincidence, but 4 months after the event, she died. Her death certificate cited heart failure as the cause of death.
Well, it's been suggested that these weapons are more humane because they attack technology, computers and so forth, rather than human beings, and the VMADs attack the human in a non-lethal way. But that's a very tricky question because there's a distinct possibility, by the way, that others will get these weapons and turn it around and fry our computers and so forth. And believe me, the job of protecting weaponry from the electromagnetic pulse is one that has not been solved and may not really in principle be solvable.
Because of its technological superiority, the U.S. military is certainly the most susceptible to those types of technological innovation. And that's why other countries who realize they can't take the U.S. military on in a fair fight are interested in developing these types of things because they think it's going to help them to even out the playing field.
With every generation and every war, we witness new and improved ways to kill people. The atomic bomb of the Second World War, napalm in Vietnam, smart bombs in Desert Storm. America stands ready to stun the world with a vast array of powerful new weapons, and other countries are lining up for this new electromagnetic arms race.
I don't know who has electromagnetic pulse weapons like the ones that we are developing. The reality is probably countries like China and Russia both do have very advanced military technology. China, for example, is at the upper tier of laser technology and things like that. So, I think those are the three countries who will develop this technology. Perhaps India might be able to do it.
Because these electromagnetic weapons are so new, they are not controlled by treaties that cover conventional weapons. The United States has plans to build a missile defense shield over Canada's north to shoot down incoming ballistic missiles. This could lead to the deployment of electromagnetic weapons in space and unleash forces too powerful to control.
I became interested in the Space Preservation Act and in developing the Space Preservation Act when I learned that our administration in Washington was looking at a program called Vision 2020. And Vision 2020 actually is a program for the United States to dominate the world from outer space. Now, I love America, and I'd like to say that we're number one. But let me tell you something. We don't need to be number one in weapons in space. The Department of Defense has been working at a facility in Alaska, which is doing research into effects of electromagnetic frequencies in the ionosphere. And that facility, which is called HAARP, has raised concern among many individuals about how this research would be applied. For example, we know that, according to some of the research, as these energy pulses are directed into the ionosphere, they can have somewhat of an effect.
What kind of negative effects remain to be seen. Electromagnetic pulses could punch holes through the ionosphere and destroy one of the Earth's protective layers in the same way that pollution depletes the ozone layer.
Some people I know have worried about messing with the ionosphere, and I think that needs a lot of investigation, because at the time we were looking at something that could be used to defend us. 6,000 nuclear warheads looking at you kind of trump just about every other thing you might want to look at. But if they ever wanted to build this antenna as big as I was talking about, then you really need to look at side effects.
A weapon can be used for protection, it can be used for deterrence, it also can be used for naked aggression. Just like the scientists that were involved in the Manhattan Project, at the end of the day, we're not responsible for where those devices were used. That decision was made by political authorities. The people involved in the development of these systems are by and large scientists at heart, and the decisions about how these devices will be used will be made by military and political officials.
There are several acts on the books of both the United States and, of course, the United Nations that deal with the preservation of space and not using it for nuclear weapons platforms. But I don't think there's much in the way of verbiage addressing non-nuclear conventional weapons platforms in space. And as our recent decision to abandon the anti-ballistic missile treaty I think clearly demonstrates, when we develop a technology that we think we can validly employ to defend the United States, forget the treaties. We are going to defend ourselves. We are going to change the treaties to be consistent with what technology now permits us. That's just going to happen.
Since 9/11, the temperature of the country has changed. I mean, to a very strongly pro-military view of the world. And at the same time, the risks, or things that were thought of even a couple of years ago as things we wouldn't take, risks we wouldn't take, now people are more willing to take them in exchanging what they think is safety, security for their own personal liberties and use of new technologies that might have other impacts that are unanticipated.
Directed energy is such a powerful technology, it could be used to heat the ionosphere to turn weather into a weapon of war. Imagine using a flood to destroy a city. or tornadoes to decimate an approaching army in the desert.
The military has spent a huge amount of time on weather modification as a concept for battle environments. Most people don't know, but the United States signed treaties with the former Soviet Union and 60 other countries in the mid-1970s where we agreed not to use geophysical manipulation as weapons of war. Presently, the treaties only allow us to do that within the boundaries of our own country. The reality is you can't contain weather by artificial boundaries.
Should we worry when America says it wants to reopen weather modification treaties? What kind of nightmare would be unleashed if we continue along this path? Although we tend to think of weapons in the context of war, police and the military have often used pepper spray, tear gas and water cannons to control unruly civilians. Microwave weapons, too, could be turned on ordinary citizens, but will they always be used in a non-lethal way?
The theory is that you can do this in such a way that you can cause the discomfort, but without causing any permanent damage. That's a question, and it's a serious question. And the follow-on question to that is, if you can control it is one thing, but what happens if you decide you don't want to control it? What happens if you decide that this is a technology that you want to use as a lethal weapon? That's an issue that's going to have to be dealt with.
You know, the last time burning was used as a way to control behavior was in the Middle Ages, when we used to burn people at the stake. It was decided it was kind of inhumane. Yet we're going back to that exact thing.
If there's one thing we've learned since the initial development of atomic weapons 60 years ago, it's that governments will try to make these devices as powerful as possible, in general. Hopefully never to be used. Hopefully to be a deterrent. But it would not surprise anyone if the government continues to try to make these devices more and more powerful, so that at some point, we don't know, and this is speculation, but at some point it may be possible to develop a device that would disable the communications and electronic systems, anything with a chip in it, the cars, the toasters, the refrigerators, the televisions, in an entire city.
If an electromagnetic pulse went off over a city, basically all the electronic things in your home would wink and go out, and they would be permanently destroyed.
We're going to go back to the 1800s. With this kind of a society, we are not going to have refrigerators, dishwashers, and dare I say even a microwave. We're not going to have cell phones, telephones, and we're going to not have any form of communication as we know it. Without this communication, there's going to be complete chaos. There's going to be panic in the streets. Talk about issues of control and crowd control in particular. It's going to be complete chaos.
We know that weapons manufacturers will continue to perfect electromagnetic weapons, but we don't know what the effects will be, either for the environment or for the people. Incidents like Bell Island's massive explosion of energy remain unexplained. Many believe that it was the result of a failed military experiment. Why else did a Russian general and Los Alamos scientists rush to the scene? One popular theory was that Russia was attempting to beam an electromagnetic signal to Cuba, but the signal was pulled down because the island's iron ore deposits and miles of underground copper piping acted like a magnet. Others insist that the beam was caused by a massive solar flare, and there is also the theory of ball lightning. We may never know what really happened on Bell Island, whether the beam was a weapon or a natural phenomenon, but we do know that weapons which will copy the Bell Island blast are the future of warfare.
What if the colossal blast had landed not on tranquil Bell Island, but on bustling Toronto or New York? What damage would it have done in a densely populated electronic jungle?
The point is, when you start looking at affecting human beings, I think we need to be involved in that discussion. Human beings need to be having that debate. If we're going to develop new weapon systems that potentially are going to change the shape of war within the democracies, particularly those that are strong and controlling the military forces of the planet right now, we ought to have those discussions, and they're not taking place.
So you never know, probably for years, what the long-term effects of the use of any weapon is going to be, and especially one like this that depends on sort of these intense bursts of radiation, electromagnetic radiation.